Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to our online class. As you know, I'm not here in Burnaby today, so we have to take an online class. But I'm sure this is not really bad news for you. It's probably easier for you guys to take this class anywhere you want. But please take it before Thursday when we have our next class. Today's an important class because you're going to learn about the first people who moved to Canada thousands and thousands of years ago. So far, what we have talked about in this class is number one, we talked about what history is in general, like a definition of history. We have looked at some of the kind of skills that historians need to practice when it comes to conducting history. And the second thing we kind of looked at was geography, of course. We have a bit of a more solid understanding of the Canadian geography. We looked at the different provinces, landscapes, the different climates, and so on. So let's get started really talking about Canadian history. And the topic for today is the First Nations of Canada. And as you can see in this image here, we can see some people, humans, who lived in Canada. And it kind of looks like they live in a more traditional lifestyle. They don't drive cars, obviously. They don't have any kinds of modern things like electricity or cell phones. They live kind of in the nature, in the forest, with some kind of houses or tents or whatever you want to call it. And if you look at the way they are dressed, it also looks a little bit more pre-modern or like kind of old school, so to speak. So we're talking about different people. We're talking about people who moved to Canada a very, very long time ago. And that's why they're called the First Nations, because they were the first people who lived in the country that we call today Canada. As you can also see in the word, though, nations does not mean nation. Nations is plural, so we'll find out more what that actually means. So today you're going to learn how to define the term First Nations. You're going to understand some of the differences when it comes to different First Nations. We want to get a better understanding of words like archaeology and history and what the difference is between these two terms. And we're also going to talk a little bit about First Nations culture. Quick review of what we have done so far in this class. Last week we looked at a handout, we looked at Canadian geography, we identified 10 different provinces, we looked at the 3 different territories, we looked at oceans, and we also looked at one of the large bays that you can see from the moon when you look down on Earth, the Hudson's Bay. So just quick repetition basically. Mountain, remember the mountains we looked at, the famous Rocky Mountains in the west of Canada. We looked at some cities such as Victoria, Vancouver, and of course the capital city of Ottawa. Okay, so now back to First Nations. What do you think the word First Nations means? Well, first I already explained, means like the people who lived here first, very long time ago. What does the word nations mean? The word nations basically refers to people or a group of people who live together, like in a village, for instance, or like in a city. And what people who live together usually share is they speak the same language. And they speak not only the same language, but they might have the same culture. They might have actually the same skin color. They might share the same culture. Maybe have the same religion, listen to the same kind of music, dress the same way, eat the same food, do things very similarly compared to other kinds of people. That together could be a nation, basically. People who live together and share and have a lot of similarities or commonalities. So when we talk about the term First Nations, really what we're saying is, long time ago in Canada, or what is today Canada, people lived here who belonged together, who shared certain things like language, culture, food, music, traditions, etc. But not just one nation, but multiple nations. That's why the word is First Nations. So a long time ago, we have lots of different First Nations who live together. And one nation is different from another First Nations, basically. But we'll go more into the detail when it comes to how nations or First Nations, how they could be different from one another. First of all, we have to ask the question, how do we know anything anyways about these people? If anyone lived here thousands of years ago, well, there must be some kind of surviving evidence or surviving documents, as I have mentioned in the previous classes. Whatever we know about history depends on what has survived, what has not been destroyed over the time by fires, by water, floodgates, war, decomposition, and so on. And when it comes to really, really old kinds of stuff, take a guess what kind of things, what kind of documents could have survived. Probably not stuff made out of wood, because wood rots or could burn. Probably not things made out of paper, because paper also gets destroyed easily. And people thousands of years ago didn't have paper available. So things that might have survived over the thousands of years might be made out of different materials, maybe out of stones, right? Or maybe bones, things like this. So in this video here, when it comes to really old history, what we have to do basically is kind of dig underground for things that have survived, such as bones, maybe of dead people, a skeleton, or maybe tools made out of stone, for instance, or other kind of hard rock materials, maybe like something like maybe a weapon, for instance, or jewelry that could also have survived, made out of precious stones, or as you can see in this image here, a vase, maybe some kind of pottery that people have used a long time ago to store stuff inside. This is basically the difference between archaeology and history. In history, as you know, we study the past, the human past, based on what has survived, the surviving documents, the surviving texts. An archaeologist is also an expert, but he has a different kind of job. As you can see in this photo here, an archaeologist is the kind of person who tries to find the stuff in the earth, first of all. So he's like an excavator. He looks, he goes through earth, through rocks, through stones, and then finds the kind of stuff. He's more of a scientist in a way, because he's really an expert in using scientific methods like brushes or maybe a microscope. He knows how not to break stuff. And when he finds stuff, what he does next is he brings it into his office, into kind of a chemistry lab, and then he kind of cleans the items with chemicals, with soaps kind of stuff, but trying to make sure nothing breaks and nothing breaks basically. And then he tries to find out how old the stuff is. How old is a bone? How old is a stone, for instance? How old is a skeleton, etc., etc. That's something historians don't do, because we don't know how to do that. You really have to be like a chemist. You have to know technology and a kind of scientific. You have to have a kind of scientific training to do these kinds of processes. So the archaeologist is more the kind of guy who finds the stuff and kind of excavates it and preserves it for the future. The historian really is the person who studies it. So it's like the next step. We study what the archaeologist has found, so to speak, and then we try to, make sense of it. What is it? What story does this object tell us? Is it a skeleton, or is it a vase, or is it a paper document? Doesn't really matter. We study these documents, these texts, and we try to make sense of them. The basic difference between archaeology and history. And if you look at this video here, you're going to see something really cool. I hope the video is working. Let's find out. Video is not working, it seems. What a surprise. Nothing works these days with technology. Okay, I'm going to upload the video on Canvas then. It's a really cool video and I want you to guys watch it. It's from the news. And it's only 2 or 3 minutes long, and it's basically about archaeology. Something really cool happened 2 years ago in British Columbia because something special was found. Okay, Canvas separately. Now, the video basically that you just have watched or will watch on Canvas, it's basically a discovery, and it's a discovery about humans who lived in Canada thousands of years ago. To be precise, 14,000 years ago. Really, really long time ago, 14,000 years ago. And the video really made the point how sensational this really is. Now, the next thing we kind of have to ask ourselves is, if people lived in Canada or North America 14,000 years ago, where did these people come from? Of course, we can use religious texts and can kind of, explain it through religious stories. That God created the earth and humans and whatnot thousands of years ago. Or we can use more scientific approach and say, well, let's see how old people are in general, and if people lived at some other continents, other places, at some other times in history. And if we do that, we'll find out that in places like Asia or Africa, people have lived for much, much longer. Not 10,000s of years, but actually hundreds of thousands of years ago. Super long time. So if people lived in Africa and Asia for much, much longer, and in Canada they lived 14,000 years ago, well, then the next question would be, people must have somehow migrated from Africa or from Asia to North America, like what is today Canada or the USA. And as the video you just watched has actually revealed, the oldest people who lived in Canada were also the oldest people who lived in all of America. So that includes North America, including Canada, the US, but it includes also South America. The people that were discovered a few years ago on Vancouver Island, 14,000 years ago, are the oldest ones in all of the Americas. So what we think happened is this. We're not sure 100%, but what we think happened is this. 14,000 years ago, or even before, the climate was very different on the planet. It was much colder. It was an ice age, where we have a lot of snow and ice all over the world, basically, and lots of masses of lands were covered with thick ice. Not only land, but also the oceans, or part of the oceans, were actually frozen with thick layers of ice and glaciers. You might have heard of this word glacier before. And if you look at the previous map, I can't go back to the previous map. If you go back to the previous map here, you can see actually that Asia and North America are very, very closely connected to one another, especially in the north. There's not much land between Asia and North America. And what we think happened is this, basically. The land was connected 14,000 years ago through ice. So whoever lived 14,000 years ago basically would have been able to walk through Asia, through ice basically, into North America. Down the coast here, which is the coast of British Columbia, of course, and then go further and further down south into what is today the USA, and then even further south into Central America and then South America. So we think in one sentence basically that the first people who came to Canada, the first people who came to all of the Americas, have an Asian background. They came from Asia and they migrated. Why did they migrate? We don't know. Maybe because of food resources, or maybe the weather was not great, or maybe there was a war and people were running away. We're not entirely sure because we don't have the surviving texts. But we do know that people did come from Asia a very long time ago. So this is the early beginnings, basically, of people coming here. So people come here, they settle down, they stay, they try to make a living, they try to survive, basically, and this is basically the beginnings of the First Nations. So they live at one particular place, they form a culture over a long time, they develop language, they talk to one another, they learn how to use the kind of geography that they live in. Remember what we talked about, how you adopt to the geography. So if you lived close to the water, these people maybe became experts in fishing, or they developed kinds of tools and kinds of other inventions that they could use with the water. For instance, building little boats that they can use on the water, on a river, on a lake. Whereas other people might have lived in a different region in Canada where there's no water, or no lake, or no river. And there they kind of developed a different kind of culture, maybe a different language, maybe having different kinds of foods, maybe inventing different weapons, and so on. So over a long time, the people who had originally come from Asia, they developed their own kinds of cultures and languages. And therefore we talk about First Nations in a plural sense and not in a singular sense. As a matter of fact, we estimate that between 500,000 to 2 million people actually lived in what we call today Canada before first contact. First contact means before the white people come, that is the European people. So for thousands and thousands and thousands of years, First Nations live here. And this is really important for us to understand this, especially for you guys, because you're not Canadians. You want to become Canadians. You want to obtain PR and citizenship. It's absolutely important to understand that we are not the first people who came to this continent, to this country. Thousands of years ago, someone else came, and they have lived here for thousands and thousands of years. Now people come from China and from Korea and from India and from other places, or I come from Europe, from Germany, right? But we need to understand that we are not the first people, that there are cultures and languages, and that's not English language, that's not the French language, it's other languages. And these places, in these places here, these languages, these cultures, these nations have lived here peacefully for thousands and thousands of years, and we need to know that, we need to respect that, of course. We estimate that there's around 630 different First Nations who lived in what we call today Canada. About 50 distinct cultures we are talking about. We are talking about 12 different language groups. So this is all kind of different. And I will explain this a little bit more detail in next class, basically. But basically what it means is, let's say we have 12 different language groups, but if you have a different language, if you have the same language, you can still have a different culture, if you know what I mean. Like, mention where you guys come from the Punjab, you speak Punjabi there, but not every village in the Punjab is the same, right? Maybe the culture differs a little bit from here to there. Maybe in these villages you make special bread, and in the other villages somewhere else, a little bit further away, you make a different kind of food. Or maybe you have a different dialect, you say words a little bit differently, or you have different words, a few different words. So it's kind of the same language, but the culture might be a little bit different. That's what it kind of means with different nations, different cultures, and different language groups, basically. But again, I'll talk more about it next week. No written languages, this is really important, but we have to understand that we don't know that much about the First Nations who lived here thousands of years ago, because they didn't have a written language. What they had, of course, was an oral language. They talked to one another, and that's how they communicate with one another. But they did not have an alphabet where they write down things on a piece of paper, for instance. So life was much more simple, much more traditional. Again, no modern inventions, no electricity, no cars, phones, nothing. As a matter of fact, I did not even have wheels, like for a cart. You could make a cart out of wood, right, for farming. Thousands of years ago, that did not exist. The people back then had not invented a wheel. There were no metal products like a sword or a knife, fork, all that kind of stuff. People did not even domesticate animals yet. Domestic means to keep animals at home, like on a farm, like have a fence around, and you used the animals for, meat or milk or whatnot. No, people back then, the First Nations who lived back then, thousands of years ago, there were three things, basically. They were hunters, so they go hunting in the forests. They were gatherers, that means they gather stuff, like collecting stuff in the forests, like plants, like berries from trees, maybe for eating, of course. And they were also fishers, hunters, fishers, and gatherers. So they walk around and they don't live in one place, they live in different places. They basically live where there is food and where the weather is basically good. So they walk around, they don't live permanently in one place. And different groups, different villages basically live in different parts of Canada, and therefore over time they develop different languages, different cultures. And that's why we have so many different First Nations in Canada. And again, this all kind of starts 14,000 years ago, according to the video that you just watched. And perhaps, who knows, history always changes, right? Maybe next year we'll find something new, and that's not 14,000 years ago. Maybe we'll find something soon that is 15,000 or 16,000 or 17,000 years old. Who knows? Okay, because First Nations did not have any written language, like I just mentioned, what they did have were oral languages, or they spoke their languages basically orally. They transmitted the knowledge that they had from one person to another through speaking. And over time, what basically happens is they developed traditions, oral traditions. So imagine your grandfather tells you a story, and then you learn the story, you remember the story, and then you tell the story, your children or your grandchildren. And this is how kind of First Nations culture, their languages, and their First Nations stories, the knowledge, everything they had basically, that's how it survived. To this day, actually, many of the First Nations stories that we have, that we still have, they have survived over such a long time period because they have been told from one generation to another. So even though there was no written language, there was still a way to communicate with one another, and there was a way to preserve knowledge and culture, basically. And because we're talking about a very, very long time ago, when people did not have cars and medicine and inventions and microscopes and internet and technology and all that kind of modern stuff, people also did not have the kinds of, scientific knowledge that we have today. For instance, we know how old things are. We can use modern technologies. We know how the earth probably was created. We can use math and science and biology and chemistry and all that kind of stuff. Didn't exist back then. So basically people made stories or tried to explain the world they lived in through stories, through kind of spiritual, kind of religious stories, believing in gods and creators and also other kinds of legends and mythical stories, so to speak. And like I said, many of these kinds of stories actually have survived. And in a few minutes, you're going to listen to one of the story of one First Nations, how the earth basically was created to one of the First Nations. Okay, what's next? So First Nations culture, as you can see here, kind of relates to the stories and the legends they kind of believed in, and they talk to each other, or they try to make sense, like how the earth was created, why does it rain, is it a god who makes it rain, is it a spirit who makes it rain, and so on and so on. And the First Nations who lived back then, I mean, they did not have the modern science and the modern knowledge that we do have today, but it doesn't mean they were unintelligent or they were stupid or whatnot. And as you can see on these kinds of images here, you see how traditional art looked like in First Nations culture. So they were really good at using wood and stones, for instance, to make weapons, but also to carve like sculptures, for instance, or making boats that you could use for transportation and so on. And this sculpture here is not a very old one, but a very famous one. It's printed on the $20 bill. And you can also see it actually at the Vancouver airport. It's really, really big. And it kind of tells us a little bit about the culture and the stories that they kind of believed in, right? So it looks like it's a boat, but the people or the creatures that you see in the boat look a little bit strange, like it's fantasy a little bit. So their culture was like, was a mix of stories that they believed in, and the kind of spirits and gods that they kind of also believed in. So maybe it looks a bit scary, but they kind of look animal-like, these creatures. Maybe it's an eagle or a beaver or a bear or a whale, and it's basically looks really big and powerful. So they might have believed in kind of animal-like gods and spirits that control the world, that control life, and that control you. So if you get sick, it's probably because the god didn't like you, because you did something really bad and you got punished. So kind of a traditional kind of culture that's not very different actually to other traditional cultures in other places of the world, perhaps even in India. If you look at this image here, we can see again what I kind of mean with the kind of traditional First Nations culture. On the right-hand side, you kind of see some masks. They might have been carved out from wood. They were even painted. And maybe people wore them on special days, maybe like a special holiday. Like in India, you have Vaisakhi, or in the Christian culture, we have Christmas, things like this. The First Nations also had their spiritual holidays. Maybe when, when a famous guy was born, or maybe the chief, or when someone died, maybe, or when there was a festival, maybe when food was collected in the fall or something like this, and everyone was happy and brought the food together. They might have had a festival or something like this. And on a festival like this, they would wear special stuff, maybe have costumes like these wooden masks that you see here. In the other images, you see some really, really tall kind of structure, obviously also made out of wood, because wood is the material that First Nations have available. There's lots of forests around them, so they could harvest the wood, right? Cut a tree and make things out of wood. You can actually see in the photograph here, which is a really old photograph, probably 100, 200 years old, you can see three things actually. Number one, which is kind of hard to see, you can see where the First Nations people lived. And it looks like behind a wall. It's like a village, right? Like a little First Nations village. And people probably lived in wooden houses. In front, you can see boats or little canoes. So it shows us that people lived close to the water, which makes a lot of sense for thousands of years ago to live close to the water. You can go fishing, as we talked about, right? Geography, history coming together. Like the people live in nature. The people use the land. The land is another word for geography. So people use the land, and it makes sense to live. And they live basically where it makes most sense to live, so close to the water. You can use the water for fishing or other kinds of things that you can harvest from it. You can use the water, of course, for drinking, or maybe for using for washing, cooking, blah, blah, blah. And you can also use the water for transportation, of course, using the little boats, because there's no highways, there's no roads, there's only nature. The First Nations, thousands of years ago, they live in nature, and they live together with nature. So there's no roads or cars or airplanes or whatnot. So boats were basically the only thing. But the third thing you see in the photograph is these long wooden structures. And that's called a totem pole. A totem pole basically is a handmade thing made from that the First Nations basically made out of wood. And again, you can kind of see the spiritual beliefs and stories in these totem poles. You see different faces. You probably don't know what it is. Is it like a spirit? Is it a monster? Is it a creature? Is it a god? Is it an animal? I mean, some looks like an eagle, right? Another one looks like a beaver. And I think it's a combination of all, right? Like there's the resemblance to animals, but there's obviously also these spiritual beliefs that if you build something like this, it's kind of a reflection of their culture, so to speak. So maybe these things were built for a festival, so you could dance around them, or you could pray to these things, right? Maybe pray to these animal gods, perhaps. Maybe it's a beaver or a bear or an eagle or a bird or whatnot. So maybe the people, well, not maybe, as a matter of fact, the people believed, and if you pray to these gods, to these animals, then the gods are going to be good to you. If you maybe sacrifice, if you give them some food, if you burn a fire, things like this, people believed in the gods will be good, the weather is going to be good, they're going to bring us food, they're not going to punish us, they're not going to kill us, etc., etc. Traditional lifestyle, traditional First Nations culture, basically. Interesting about totem poles also is, as you can see on this photograph, there's multiple of them, not only one of them. Number two, they're really tall and large, and number three, they all point into the same direction, and they all face, this is a little bit hard to see in the photograph, they all look into the water or into the ocean. So we also think that the First Nations used these totem poles for kind of protective purposes, that believing in these gods, they pray to these gods, hoping that they would protect them from, I don't know what, a disaster or something bad to happen, basically. And because they all look into the water, into the ocean, the First Nations basically were hoping that these totem poles protect them or maybe scare away monsters that could live in the ocean. Of course, there's no monsters as we know, but this is modern thinking, modern knowledge. Thousands of years ago, First Nations thought, no, there are monsters in the ocean. And they might kill us, they might eat us, they might destroy all of us. So we need protection. So these totem poles kind of served as protection. And they are tall, so the monsters can see them. Maybe what they were thinking back then was just a big whale, or maybe, I don't know, an octopus or something. But it's likely that they were thinking there were some monsters in the ocean back then, basically. And again, we can see kind of parallels to other First Nations cultures, for instance, or other cultures in the world. I mean, many times, even in India, I think it's pretty common if you walk into a big building, into like a palace, at the entrance, you can see big animals, like a lion, right? Sing, like a strong lion. Sing means strong, lion, right? So when you walk into a palace, why is there a lion on each side at the entrance of the door? Similar idea. The lion protects kind of the owner, the ruler, the king of the palace, so to speak. So we can see kind of, even though First Nations culture might seem really, really strange and really, kind of different from what you guys know and from where you guys come from. I mean, we're talking about something very, very old, and we do see parallels to other First Nations cultures in other places like Asia, Europe, Africa, and so on. So let's talk a little bit more about First Nations culture. How were First Nations kind of organized? Well, like I said, they lived in little villages, basically. And in a village, the First Nation, like one village could be an entire nation. Like one village could have an entire different language or different dialect. Or let's say there were 5 villages in Burnaby. That together is like one First Nation, okay? And they spoke one dialect, for instance, okay? And then there's 5 villages in Surrey. And these guys speak a little bit of a different language, a little bit of a dialect, and they live all together, and they like each other, and they're related to one another. And then there's 10 different villages in, let's say, Abbotsford, okay? And again, it's a different First Nation, and maybe there the language is not a little bit different, actually it's a little bit more different. So the First Nations in Burnaby and Surrey, they can kind of understand each other, even though they have different words and different dialects. They're different First Nations, but they can understand each other. But the Burnaby First Nations and the Abbotsford First Nations, they can't understand each other because they're just too far away from each other, and they do actually speak different languages. So who is the kind of boss in one of these First Nations villages? The boss, the highest guy, basically was called the chief. The leader of the village was called the chief. And you're kind of, how do you become a chief? It's kind of hard to say. But if you're really good at fighting, first of all, it's always a man. If you're fighting, you are a good warrior, a good hunter, basically, then you could become a chief. And if you're a chief, then the son of you also would become the next chief, basically, in the village, okay? Another super important person in the First Nations village or community was the medicine man or the medicine woman, so to speak. And that kind of person is the spiritual leader. So that person knows more about gods and religion and whatnot, but also allegedly, apparently also about medicine. And again, this is a really long time ago. There's no modern science, no biology, no, microscopes and testing and labs and experiments and science. So basically, the medicine man just tried to talk to the gods, basically, if someone was sick. So if you're sick, you go to the medicine man, women, you ask for help. Mr. Medicine Man, I'm sick, I feel unwell, can you help me? And then the medicine man basically would talk to the gods and ask for forgiveness and ask that you get kind of better, so to speak. And because there was no modern medicine, they tried some simple kind of medicine. And the medicine man knows most about that kind of medicine. So for instance, maybe making a tea out of different leaves from plants that grow in the forest or in nature, basically. The medicine man would experiment or maybe mix different plants together and make like a drink that hopefully makes you feel better. But as you can imagine, many times this would not work. If you're really seriously ill, let's say you have cancer or something like this, then you would die. And the medicine man obviously is powerless and cannot do anything about it. And then the medicine man probably would say, nah, the god is really angry at you, he's punishing you, something like this. First Nations very much believe in living together with nature. So they're part of nature, and their religious belief is that they are part of nature. Therefore, they see themselves not as different or as better or as higher than nature, than animals and than the plants, for instance. They have this kind of respect for nature, and they want to live peacefully together with nature, not to destroy nature. It's kind of funny, right? Thousands of years ago, already we have this belief that people realize we have to protect nature if we want to keep living, if we want to have a future, if our culture wants to have a future, if our children and children's children want to have a future. So living peacefully in coexistence with nature was part of the belief, basically. And if they take something from nature, well, they do it for themselves, of course, to live a happy life and to survive, but they also give it back, so to speak, or they know they will give it back. For instance, if they die, the belief was that they will be born again. That kind of that belief in being born again, being reborn, is what we call reincarnation. But when you are born again, you might not be born as a human. Maybe you're going to be born as a tree, or next time you're born, maybe you're a deer or a bear. So you see yourself part of nature. You don't see yourself as different as nature or compared to nature, basically. And that's really interesting. So, for instance, when the First Nations people would kill an animal, they wouldn't see it as a bad thing that you killed an animal, that you killed something that had to die and suffer in pain. They saw it more in a religious way, that the body now died and we can eat the meat, basically, but the soul and the spirit of the animal survives and goes up in heaven and basically comes back being reborn, maybe then in a different form as a plant or a human or an animal, if that makes any sense. So they had these religious traditional beliefs in spirits and in the souls that kind of live on after death, so to speak. Okay, so this is spirit animals, reincarnation, humans created and animals created together. People are part of one, basically. And yeah, oftentimes they would also believe in other kinds of visions and signs, and even in their dreams. So what they dream, for instance, they could think this will happen actually, or this could be a sign that something is going to happen. Alrighty, so this is basically it when it comes to First Nations culture, or like just a brief introduction into First Nations. Again, we'll talk more about it next week. To finish the class for today, I want to talk briefly about First Nations today, because this is again something important for you to understand, especially if you want to live in Canada or if you want to remain in Canada. So First Nations were the first people to come to Canada, and they are still around. This is another important fact you guys have to realize. There are still people who are First Nations, who have First Nations culture, for instance. So their ancestors came here thousands of years ago. Like my ancestors are obviously in Germany. Your guys' ancestors are in India. Chinese people who live in Canada, their ancestors are in China. But First Nations ancestors are in Canada, and they have lived here for thousands of years. As you've learned last week, the population of Canada is around 33 million people. Out of the 33, around 2 million people are First Nations. Okay, so it's a minority, but it's an important minority that we have to understand. It's a lot of people, nevertheless. Now, most of the First Nations, of course, no longer live the traditional lifestyle they lived thousands of years ago, like believing in all these gods, or living in nature in like a tent, eating food with their hands, for instance. Of course, they use the modern stuff that we also use, having electricity, living in houses, driving cars, and so on. So they are kind of assimilated to Western lifestyle. The word assimilate means they kind of accepted Western lifestyle, and they are part of Western lifestyle. But at the same time, they also try to keep some of the First Nations culture. For instance, all First Nations nowadays speak English, so they have adapted to Western languages like English. But some of them might maintain a non-Western First Nations cultural heritage, like a religious belief, or maybe a festival, or maybe a traditional dress that you don't dress every day, but maybe once or twice a year on a traditional festival, you dress in a traditional First Nations way. So that's kind of the mix. And this really relates to you guys, right? When you're learning English now, you're eating Western food, you're living in the Western world, but you all want to keep your lifestyle, your Sikh beliefs, for instance, or on Vaisakhi holidays, you dress in a traditional way. And of course, you want to keep Indian food, etc., etc. So in a very similar way, First Nations try to do the same. They're in a similar situation. Because they have lived here the longest, they also have a number of special rights. And they have these special rights, and we're going to learn more about this in the next few weeks. They have a number of special rights today because for the last few hundreds of years, when the white-skinned people from Europe, when they come here, these white people are not nice to the First Nations because the white people think they're better. Right? The same thing with India. When the British people ruled in India, they kind of discriminated Indian people. They were kind of racists. Well, same thing in Canada. White people come to Canada, they kind of discriminate against the First Nations people. They're not nice to them. Again, we'll talk much more about it in the next few weeks. But just for now, what I want to say is because we have this kind of bad relations, or there used to be bad relations between the white people and First Nations, now we live in a time where we ask for forgiveness, where we apologize, where like a Canadian politician, like a Canadian president, etc., would say sorry, etc., for what we have done in the past. And to say sorry, we give you things to make up for, like saying sorry, like asking for forgiveness, so to speak. And some of these rights include things like giving them free land, the First Nations, because they lived here the longest, right? Technically, it is their land. The white people come later, or we people come later. We take away land from the people who were here first, the First Nations. So First Nations oftentimes nowadays, in 2019, they would live on land where they don't have to pay money or they don't have to pay taxes for the land. Other things are they get free healthcare. They don't have to pay money for medical services to go to the hospital. And a third example would be First Nations have a free access to education. They can go to university for free. Really interesting, right? So these are some of the special privileges or rights that First Nations enjoy. But at the same time, First Nations also face problems to this day in 2019. They face more problems when it comes to unemployment, because oftentimes they had not been given a job by the white people, because they were considered as, that's a form of discrimination, right? They would not get a job, basically. Or oftentimes oftentimes there are problems around alcohol and drug consumption. And here the reason kind of is because their bodies work a little bit different. The white people can deal with alcohol in their body, in their blood. First Nations cannot, or they deal differently. The bodies deal differently with alcohol. So there are more problems with alcohol. And a third example is other diseases like diabetes. Just imagine when the white people come and talk to the First Nations and bring new things like alcohol, that's completely different for their bodies, that causes a problem. And the white people also bring their own food, Western food, which makes you more fat, like sugar food, breads, these kinds of things. And again, that's something that First Nations also, not everyone of course, but many have a hard time dealing with, or their bodies have a hard time dealing with, and therefore diabetes, which is a disease, of course, that disease is also quite common, or happens more commonly amongst the First Nations. Okay, so this is our introduction to First Nations, the first people who come and live in Canada before Canada even becomes Canada, the land that we call today Canada, basically. It starts 14,000 years ago, and therefore it's a very important chapter in our history. So now that we are done, there's two things I want you guys to do, basically. The video with the discovery 2 years ago, it's only a 2-minute video. I want you to watch it, and then I'm going to show you another video, or YouTube video, which is I only think 6 minutes long. It's not great sound, the audio is not great, but anyways, it's a really interesting story, because it's a First Nations traditional spiritual kind of story. Okay, so you watch these videos, and then you basically participate on Canvas, where I have like 2 questions for you guys. Okay, and you just write 2, 3, 4 sentences with your opinion. What do you think about the videos? That's it. And once you have participated, I know I can read your sentences, so I know you have watched the stuff. I know you have participated, so you're going to get some participation points. And because I see you have written the sentences, you also will get attendance points at the same time. Okay, that's it. Have a great day, and I'll see you all on Thursday. Thanks.